Welcome to the Uncharted podcast. I am your host, Inez Franklin. My hope for you today is that we discover faith beyond the boundaries. Uncharted is intended to be a safe place for you to listen, learn, and challenge yourself along your journey of faith. May grace and peace be with you today. Welcome to the show. Well, Kayleigh, today we're going to talk about how to remain faithful in the ups and the downs of the journey of faith. Because as we've been talking all along, right, there's a mystery on the journey of faith. There's ambiguity on the journey of faith. There's great joy, but it's not linear. We sometimes have high moments, wonderful seasons, mountaintop experiences with God, but we also have seasons of struggle and suffering. And we've had these great podcast interviews with people who have shared with us their own journeys of suffering and learned so much. But today we want to talk about how do we remain faithful through it all? How do we stay with a thriving faith through it all? Which I want. I want to have that faith that makes it through any kind of testing that life might throw my way. And it's something I pray for because as much as I want it to happen, I realize I won't know the strength of my faith until I hit those really low places or even those really high places. And I include both because as we have these great moments with God, it's very easy for us to sort of say to God, we don't need you, right?
Yeah.
Even if we don't say it, we start behaving like maybe we don't need God right now. And in low moments, we might be so angry with God that we might start to have doubts or even a desire to just you know what, I'm believing in the wrong thing and just checking out. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting you say that because I've always said that I think I'm more of the person who digs into my faith when I'm struggling than when I'm on a mountaintop. And it's not so much that on a mountaintop I don't see God. It's just exactly like you said. I don't think I find myself needing him. And so therefore I'm okay, I can go about my day-to-day life. Um, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness, one of my chronic illnesses, right, when I was 22 years old. And I did in that season get angry at God and then say, wait a minute, I've been a good kid. I didn't do anything wrong. I eat healthy. I exercise. How am I the one that now is going to have to deal with something for the rest of my life? And then I worked through that. I think I recognized it's not God who's just out here trying to punish me. It's not a punishment at all. It's just a reality of living on this earth, that there's going to be suffering and things that we need to deal with. And that's something I'm going to need to deal with. What's the non-sanctified part of Kayleigh? So this is deep down thoughts. And it's just a reality. It's so interesting that I really struggle sometimes with my chronic illnesses, which now I have 5. That I feel like chronic illnesses are hypothetically for the rest of our life on earth. Yes, God can heal me at any moment, but it's not a humongous process I have to deal with for a season of time and then I get better or hopefully get better, right? Instead, it's something I have to constantly deal with every single day in different ways. I have to go and get these low dose chemo infusions every 6 weeks for eternity. I have to go to doctors for the rest of my life. There's all these things I have to do that don't get better at some point. Hypothetically, saying that God does not heal me tomorrow, I am doing this for the rest of my natural born life. And it feels discouraging and it tends to make me compare, which is right. It allows me to sit in the suffering longer because then I'm looking at other people who maybe have a health issue or something that they need to manage. Sometimes, again, the non-sanctified part of me, okay, so it's not something I'm saying to go do, but the non-sanctified part of me even looks at people who deal with really big diagnoses, right? Health, risking diagnoses and think, well, at least it's temporary. At least you're coming to a conclusion at the end of that decision. but I'm living in it. Like I never get to that conclusion. I'm always with it, you know? And so I think that there's a part to which suffering can feel like a comparison game, which I know we've talked about on this podcast before, but it just bears repeating that it's really easy for us to kind of go back on that cycle when we're in the midst of that space.
Yes, but obviously comparison can come at any time, and
Yeah.
we've talked about it how it's a terrible trap, honestly, because it's interesting that when we compare, we're very choosy about who we compare with. Like,
Yeah.
for example, I appreciate that your honesty, your non-sanctified side, right? The not Christ-like is what you're really
Yes.
saying.
Yes.
Time because I say I recognize that too because we will choose who to compare ourselves with. But if you compare yourself to someone who has a terrible skin disease that's going to be for their whole life, and I've seen pictures of people who have
Yeah.
horrifying skin diseases and that doesn't go away, well, then you would actually feel better about your condition because you can
Right.
walk around and you look beautiful.
Yeah.
But we choose to compare ourselves with people, perhaps, that we,
Who
again,
seem
anytime we
to have
compare,
it easier. Yeah.
right, right.
Totally.
We, if we're trying to, make ourselves feel worse, we go there. If we're in a place where we're looking at people who have it better than us, again, we're going to be choosy who we're going to pick. We're going to choose
Yeah.
what better is. Either way, comparison is not a good thing.
Yeah.
So we can agree right off the bat today that to remain faithful in the journey of faith, whether you're in a high moment or a low moment, comparison is not the way to go. Because that only brings us to either greater pride or greater despair at some point or another. It's just what it does, comparison. It's a
Yeah.
cancer,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And
But
so
let's talk about
then,
on this one. Let's talk
yeah.
about this one for a second. When we are either at a high moment or a low moment, we can also get pretty self-absorbed. And I
Yeah.
know self-absorbed sounds like a very negative statement, and of course it can be. But I'm talking more about we are just thinking of ourselves.
Mm.
We're hyper focused on ourselves. Again, if we're in a really high place and things are going wonderful, we're like just thinking about our position there and what we're experiencing and how wonderful it is and all of that. And we may not be selfish. We just are thinking about it. We're
Mm-hmm.
obsessed with it or spending a lot of time
Yeah.
there. If we're hurting, suffering, a deep sadness, we can also go there where all we can think about is our circumstances, our problem. We cannot see someone else. And it doesn't have to be rooted in selfishness. It can be rooted simply in where we're placing our focus, just a
Yeah.
misplacement of focus.
Yeah.
And that can be really damaging too. I mean, how does that, for example, affect you on your own journey with your diseases and how you've had to grow in this journey? Because you've been doing this now for quite a while. It's been,
Yeah.
gosh, Kayleigh,
14
what
or
is it,
12
13?
years. 12
Right,
years.
12 years.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, how has that worked out for you, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is such a good reminder and acknowledgement, right? Because it's something that it's so easy to just focus on myself and my illnesses and what I need to do and how I need to manage it. I think that it would be easy for me to live my life just really honestly focusing on the illnesses that I deal with every 6 weeks, going to the doctor and having to spend a whole day like dealing with the ramifications of this medication, which also makes me feel better. There are so many ways I could really like inflict a lot of focus on myself. But over time and with my faith growing, I've just realized A, that's not useful or helpful. And B, if I'm going to deal with something, I'm going to learn something from it. And
Mm,
so I know that this is something I have to deal with. And I have learned that, hey, focusing on myself in this process is not going to help me even feel better. Right. And
yeah.
so I'm going to instead focus on God and, okay, God, what do you want to teach me in this? God, what do you want to show me in this? And I will say that a few years ago, I kind of recognized like, hey, if I'm never healed here, although I pray for it and I want for it and I desire for it. And there was a season in which he did heal me of most of my symptoms and I was symptom free.
Like a
I
remission, like you were
Yeah,
in
it was
remission of some of
exactly.
these.
It was in like a major remission that lasted well over a year and then it came back and God said just because the The pain came back and the symptoms came back didn't mean I didn't heal you in that season. You needed to be
I
healed in
love
that
that.
season, so I did, And so but despite that, like what I learned and what I recognized about myself a few years ago was even if I am never healed fully, if I am
Mm,
never like symptom free, if I always deal with pain on this side of heaven, what I have learned is that it's not just about my story, that I talk about my illnesses so that I can support others who are going through stuff, so that I have empathy and compassion and understanding about those who are suffering physically in
yes,
some way, shape, or form. Now, that
that's
may
good.
look different. Everyone's chronic illness may be different. It may not even be a chronic illness. Like you said, it may be someone with a skin disease. It may be someone dealing with cancer. It may be someone dealing with all sorts of different things. But through it,
Mental,
I
like
have
a mental disease, right?
right. Yeah.
Yes.
But through it, I have learned and experienced what it's like to not feel 100%. And so,
Yeah.
therefore, I can support people in the midst of that journey, in the midst of learning how to operate your body or your mind or your life through a lens that looks different, feels different, that maybe other
Yes.
people don't understand. And so, even though
That's
someone may not be able to say, oh, like, okay, Kay, I get it. That makes sense. I want to support you in that. I can look at others and say that same thing and say, hey, I know what it's like to have to go through all these doctors. I'd love to help you with that. I know what it's like to not know what the answer is. Like, I'd love to just walk with you through that and support people in that journey because I've been through it and I've
mhm.
experienced what that's like.
It it's one of the beautiful things that God does with our experiences, whether they're high or low. Nothing is wasted, nothing.
Yeah.
And when it comes to any area of suffering, I feel that God is particularly fruitful and productive in making the most out of that terrible experience. That doesn't cause our suffering. He doesn't even cause our suffering for the purposes of creating
Yeah.
good, right? So let's make that clear. But when suffering does happen, because we live in a broken world and we're affected by sin in this world, that He maximizes the fruit that can come out of it. And we may not even see all of it. So this is where one of the passages I love is in Second Corinthians. I think Second Corinthians. Every time,
Look it up.
as much
Gotta
as I
look it
love
up.
this passage, you would think that I know exactly where it is, but it is Second Corinthians chapter 1. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort. He comforts us in all of our affliction, so that we may
Mm,
be able to comfort those who are in any kind of affliction through the comfort we ourselves receive from God. So it's so beautiful that, like you say, you're going through a season, you're learning some things. Now you have an empathy and you're equipped by God, by the
yeah.
comfort He's given you to now comfort others. And what's fascinating is that as we go into that, we actually receive even more healing. And
Yeah.
I know that from my own life, when some of the suffering I've experienced, as God has comforted my heart and healed my heart. And then I go and out of empathy, because I know what it's like to be in that situation. For example, I've been through divorce, not only
Right.
one divorce, but two divorces. So my heart towards those who are going through divorce is different because I've been through it. I know that
Yeah.
loss. And not only that, when I am used by God to comfort someone else, when the empathy He's given me, the understanding of what it's like to be in this place allows me to help someone else, that in turn heals my heart even more.
Yeah.
It just sort of is this beautiful cyclical healing process of receiving more and more comfort from a loving God. I just love that.
Yeah. And I think that there's so many passages throughout scripture that talk about suffering. I actually find
Yeah.
that so fascinating that we actually have this whole book, right? With tons of different authors and passages and letters and stories and wisdom. And all of it is reminding us that suffering is going to exist on this earth and that we don't have to do it alone.
Yes.
I'm gonna point us to my favorite book of the Bible, which is James. I feel like James is so pointed in the way that he speaks. He's so wise, and, for
It's a
those who
book of
don't
wisdom,
know yep, yeah,
a
and for
letter of
those who
wisdom.
don't know, James is the half brother to Jesus, and so I don't know, for some reason, there's a part of me that when I read James, I just feel so connected to Jesus's story because he's was a part like James is a part of of the family that Jesus was a part of. And so I think James does a really beautiful job of also teaching us how to live in suffering, and the fact that, yes, suffering exists, but he gives a very unique mindset that I want us to read today. So I'm going to
Love
read you
that.
guys the CSB version first, and then I'm actually going to share a little bit different out of the AMP version and some of the Greek, because we got just, there's just a lot of different things. And I think the Bible is so cool like that. So
Yep.
hold on one second. Let me get to it.
Well, and what you
Pages. Here we
do,
go. Yes.
while you look at the page, what you do, the amazing thing about James is what he says about how to navigate suffering. It's a bit shocking. It's
Yeah.
surprising. It's
Yeah.
the opposite of what you expect. Almost, if you don't really look at it carefully, you might almost feel like, James, you don't know suffering. James knew suffering. Let's make this clear. He knew suffering. He had seen a lot of suffering. He had seen persecution. So this is a man who has suffered and now is teaching us, like, how do we remain faithful in a time of suffering?
Yes, I love that. Okay, so James 1 verses 2 and 3 is where we're at right now. And again, this is the CSB version. It says, "Consider it a great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance." We see this in Paul, we see it in James, we see it in all these places where we are told, be joyful, be joyful, be joyful in the midst of
Rejoice
suffering.
always, Paul
Rejoice
says.
always. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
But I want us to point actually a little bit deeper into that first passage in verse 2. In the AMP version, it says, "Consider it nothing but joy." Nothing but joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you fall into various trials. So I looked it up in the Greek, because whenever there's a translation difference
That's a good
between all the
practice.
Bible
Yes.
translations, I want to figure out, okay, where did they pull this? Why did they change it? What is it trying to
Yes.
really say? And in
And
the
for
AMP,
our listeners, Kayleigh, I
yes.
apologize to cut you
No,
off,
you're
but
good.
for our listeners, tell them where you went to look at the original language.
Yeah,
You use
so
Bible Hub?
so you can use Bible Hub. You can use Blue Letter Bible. Blue Letter Bible is one of my favorites. I feel it's a free resource. It has so much information on it. It's great. But I also use a very an expensive one, which is Logos. So I look up a lot of things on Logos as well. But for the everyday listener who just wants to get more involved in studying the Word, Blue Letter Bible or Bible Hub are great free resources that will provide you with both the Hebrew and the Greek, depending on what you're reading.
Right.
Or
so
the
you
Aramaic,
type in
'cause
the
there's some
verse.
Aramaic.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So the way it works is you type in the verse and you click in the word, and it'll actually give you the original language word and the different meanings of that word. So you can get a
Yes.
sense of, like, oh, I can see how that translation group of people, because it's usually a group of people who get together. These are theologians and obviously quite intelligent, brilliant people who get together and they study the original language, the context, lots of things that they study and translate, but they're making some interpretations in translation. And obviously some groups will come up with slightly different ways of translating. And the Amplified specifically is looking to give us a bigger kind of more language around what's being described. Because sometimes to go from one language to another, you lose some of the meaning. And so, especially when you go from Greek to English, and so there's so much more nuance in the original language than we have in our English language. So they try to use words that kind of bring some of that meaning forward. So that was the context.
Amen.
Go ahead,
I loved
Kayleigh.
that moment of preach. I feel like that was important. I do, because it's so, I'm just going to real quick, while we're detouring, I'm just going to say, because this is something I'm passionate about, because it's true. Like, I think I've learned as we started studying this in more detail, Greek and Hebrew, I feel like our English language falls short all the time. So I will challenge anyone listening today to study some of this ancient text find those words, figure out what those things are. And it is why I love the Amplified, because I do feel like the Amplified does give a little more context, but they also add in other things. So you have to be really clear about what you're studying. And no matter what verse translation you study with, be willing to look at other ones and be willing to look at the original, because the original is what we're working with here. We're all just translating it anyways. Okay, so
That's
now
right.
that we're back, nothing but is the one I want us to focus on. So in that verse 2, it says, consider it nothing but joy. So it's not just that it's great joy, which is what the CSB translated it at, because when I think great joy, I think like it's a very positive joy. It's a
Super
big amount of joy.
happy.
It's like, yeah, like you're like skipping down the road, right? Like that's not actually what is in the Greek. And so I saw nothing but, and I went to the Greek, and the Greek talks about ever, always, constant. So nothing but is actually the right language, right? Because if it's always joyful, then you're never not joyful. You're not
That sounds
ever
like Paul, doesn't it?
Exactly. Always rejoice.
Rejoice always. That's right.
Yes. And so I just felt like that was really important because no matter, right, both James and Paul, and there's more places where it's like this constant reminder of like, always be rejoicing, always be joyful, always be celebrating. But you actually talked about this in your book a little bit, which is like whenever you fall into various trials, which is at the end of verse 2, that fall into is also in Greek, it actually means to be surrounded by trials.
Yes,
So now
exactly.
let's like take this whole picture of what James actually was saying. He's saying when you're actually surrounded by, and if you're watching me on YouTube, you'll see my hands are moving, surrounded by, imagine yourself in a room of all your trials. Trials are hitting you left, right, and center. You cannot escape the trials. And he is saying,
In my
even
book,
in
I
that
use the
space,
picture. In my book, I use the picture of being thrown into water. Like you are
yes,
surrounded by water when you're in a pool, for example, and you're underwater. It's touching everything. It's that close all around you. Yes.
yes, exactly. Exactly. It's like literally you can't get rid of it. And you are to always and ever nothing but, there should be nothing else going on in your mind. No matter what's happening in the world around you, no matter what suffering you're in, you should be living with joy, which is so much easier said than done.
That's right.
It is, right?
It should cause us to go, and how do we do that? How
Yeah.
do we do
Yeah.
that when we're suffering? I mean, the very first thing we should say is like, that's impossible. And of course, just to clarify too,
Yeah.
that joy, the word for joy isn't just happiness and celebration.
Yeah.
Joy it's a much, again, one of those very rich words that have to do with a sense of rightness in our heart and a sense of even contentment in our heart that does not match the circumstances that we're facing. That joy can have celebration, it can have high energy, high emotion, but it also can be suffering, and yet there is this peace in my heart, that there's this contentment in my heart, there's a comfort in my heart. There's a lot of words to try to describe that deeper sense of joy that is not necessarily the same as happiness and celebration, but yet it is a blessed state because there's this place where these circumstances are not taking away a sense of peace and some level of happiness that seems to be not make any sense based on what we're experiencing.
Yep, absolutely. And so we see this yet again, but what I appreciate so much about James is he doesn't just leave us with that statement. He then goes on to explain,
how do you manufacture that?
How do you
Right?
how do you create
Yes.
this? And so I'm going to keep reading out of the AMP a little bit, and we'll just kind of go through this a little bit line by line. So he talks, right? We said in verse 3 that it produces endurance. So starting at verse 4, and let endurance have its perfect result and do a thorough work, so that you may be perfect and completely developed in your faith, lacking in nothing. So it talks about that when we have that perpetual, always, nothing but joy mentality, even in the midst of suffering, we will then produce endurance. And that endurance will actually allow us to lack nothing. So it's almost like they do it to each other. You have nothing but joy, which then produces endurance, and the endurance helps you have nothing but joy. Like it literally, and what it also builds in that nothing but joy, I think the number one thing is it creates your faith to be stronger. Your endurance creates your faith to be stronger. And so you can hold a nothing but joy mindset when you are like living faithfully, like trusting and having faith in God no matter what.
Yes. And of course, we're going to talk in a minute how we actually get that, because again,
Yes.
we're not going to manufacture this joy.
Yeah.
It's not
Yes.
like you're going to go, okay, is it positive thinking? We're going to talk about that in a minute. But before we do, let me share a story, because
Yeah.
Jim and I had the privilege of having a couple stay in our house over the last month. It was just amazing that we got to do this. And this couple is actually from Iran. They became Christians in Iran. And shortly after they married, they were both arrested and put into prison simply because they were sharing their faith with others. I won't mention their names because for their security purposes, you'll understand in a minute, we don't want their names put out there. However, they were in prison. He was in prison for almost 3 months, and she was in prison for a month and a half. Both of them were in solitary confinement. He was in it longer than her. She was 3 weeks in solitary confinement, and he spent almost 2 months, almost the 2 months that he was in prison in solitary confinement. And what was fascinating to hear from their stories was that they had a little teeny room that if they stood up and walked, it would be 3 steps and they hit the wall. 3 steps, they hit the door. That's how short it was. It was just enough to lay down flat on the ground, not necessarily straight. They had to bend their knees. The light was on all the time. They never got their lights turned off. So they had to sleep like that, and they had a teeny little window where they can see some sunlight way up high where they couldn't really see out, but they could see the sky. And they had a bucket, which was for their personal, disposal,
to go to the bathroom. Yeah.
which was to go to the bathroom. Thank you. I'm trying to figure out how to say that by the door. And so the light was by the door. The bucket was by the door. So you had 2 choices. Either you lay your head by the bucket so that the light wouldn't be hitting your face directly, which was stink, or you put your head over on the other side of the room where the light was strongest, but at least you weren't sitting there smelling your own waste.
Yeah.
And they chose to obviously sleep away from the bucket, but they only got 1 blanket for the ground and 1 blanket to cover their bodies. And it was winter because they were arrested literally on Christmas Day of all days. And it was very, very cold. And supposedly the heating system wasn't working in the prison. That's what they were told. But it was all part of the punishment they were getting.
Yeah.
And when they share their stories, this is a terrible suffering. I can't even imagine sleeping for 1 night with a light shining on my face, even with a thin blanket to try to cover myself, let alone weeks of that in this little teeny space with no one to talk to. I can't even imagine that.
Yeah.
And what they both shared was how, yes, they struggled. It was very painful. It was very, very hard. They did not minimize how hard that season was. And yet in their hearts, they had a joy because they were suffering for their faith. Isn't that something? They felt like, wow, Jesus, following you, this is like really my faith is being tested. It was harder for her. She had a harder time than he did. He was bringing up worship songs and singing in the prison. So they were like, what are you doing in there? And he was singing loud. He has an amazing voice. So he was singing pretty loud and they were complaining. The guards were trying to get him to be quiet. She cried a lot and slept a lot, but still, she said as much as it was harder for her, she still felt a sense of joy in her heart that she was suffering for her faith. And when they share the story, I wish you could meet them because, of course, they got out of prison for a short while, and then they were supposed to go back in prison and remain in prison, but because they were waiting for a hearing. But during that in between time, they were able to be smuggled literally out of the country, Iran, and seek refuge with the UN. And now they have a visa elsewhere, so they are able to travel. But when you hear them tell the story, there is a beaming glow about them. Yeah. And I in fact, when they shared their story, I thought, is it hard for you? Are you reliving that trauma every time you share your story? And they're like, oh, no, we are sharing just incredible joy. And it's so beautiful to share that. And so I feel like I watched them share with me this thing that I want, that if my faith was tested to that level, I want that so bad. So I'm thinking someone listening right now going, okay, how do I remain joyful, have nothing but joy in the midst of my suffering? Let it be strengthening my faith. Let it be something that not only helps me endure, but helps me not lack nothing. How do I do that, Kayleigh? How do I get that kind of wisdom out of it. Yes.
Yes. And instead of me just answering the question, we're going to go back into James and we're going to keep reading because James gives us the answer. So,
Yeah. Okay.
starting at verse 5, which is where we finished off at verse 4. So now at verse 5. If any of you lacks dun, 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 wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
he is to ask of God, who gives to everyone generously and without rebuke or blame, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without doubting. For the one who doubts is like a billowing surge of the sea that is blown about and tossed by the wind. And I want to read just one more verse in that, which it says, for such a person ought not to think or expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable and restless in all his ways.
Ooh,
So
them are hard words.
I know they are. And they're challenging, right? Because it talks about like being blown about. It talks about being double-minded, which is like, you don't want to be any of those things. That's why I like James. James is pointed. He's like, here, this is how it is.
That's
Uh,
true.
but I will say that he starts that passage so well, that section so well in his passage, which it just says, if any of you lacks wisdom, all you have to do is give it to him. All you have to do is go back to him and tell him, and he will be with you in it. And I feel like that is something that we often can overlook. Solomon did the same thing. Solomon went to God and said, I just want wisdom. And God said, oh my gosh, yes, I will give
Done.
you wisdom. And
Done.
then I'm also going to give you all these things that you could have asked for and I would have given you and you didn't ask for. So I'm now not just going to bless you with wisdom. I'm going to bless you with all of these things because God is so generous and he wants to bless us with wisdom. He wants us to be wise, And so I think that there's just such a beauty in that the way we get constant joy, the way we get nothing but joy, the way we do that no matter our circumstances, like those you just shared with us, your friends, is to seek wisdom and to gain wisdom from God.
And what is wisdom but simply a heavenly mindset, like God's
Yeah.
thinking, God's way of thinking. And so when we say consider, ask God for wisdom because he wants to give it to us. God wants to tell us his desires. He wants to help, he wants
Yeah.
to reveal himself to us. The whole Bible is about a good and loving God that seeks to reveal himself to us. That's why James is so harsh when he says, don't ask with doubt, because if you're really asking God to
Yeah.
reveal himself to us, like really
Have faith.
ask from it
Yeah.
and ask from an honest heart. Even right when the man told Jesus, I believe, but help me with my unbelief.
Yeah.
That's asking, saying, I know you have something to give me here. I know you're willing to give it to me. I'm really asking for it and believing that you're going to give it to me. And so this beautiful picture of like being surrounded, being oppressed, like my friends were being oppressed in prison, like maybe you felt oppressed when you're dealing with suffering, or some
Yeah.
of the people we have interviewed who have
Yeah.
suffered deep loss, just
Yeah.
tragic losses that make no sense.
Yeah.
When you're that upset, you need a different way of thinking. And that's why he says consider, like rethink, like seek out the way that the situation, seek a different way of looking at it, and ask God to give you his perspective. Ask
Yes.
for God's way of looking at it. And when we
Yes.
do, that's how we get to look at, even in the midst of suffering, that's how we get to experience a joy that doesn't go away, that strengthens our faith, that it makes us endure even the most difficult times. And it even helps us endure the high mountaintop moments of life when things are wonderful and we might be
Yeah.
tempted to let go of God, even in our high moments. So we can say, God, give me wisdom here. Give me wisdom in
Yeah.
this high moment, that I don't lose myself to pride or to, independence from you or selfishness. At either place, we seek God's wisdom because the way he sees things is much better than the way we do.
Amen. Yes, I love that. And I think, it's really interesting because God is faithful and all
Yes.
he asks of us is our faith back. And that
Yeah.
by our faith, right, he will provide all of these beautiful things. By our faith in him, when we request these things, he will provide these things. He does, like you said, he wants to give them to us. He wants us to be wise. He wants us to live with the fruits of the Spirit. It's not like he wants to withhold. He's a good and loving
Right.
God. And so he wants to provide us with the faith we need to make it through our suffering. And
Yes.
so
Yes. And
I
strengthen
get,
us, right? Along the
yes,
way.
exactly. Exactly. So what are things that our listeners can do then to help encourage this, to kind of work through this? What are some extra tools we can give them?
Well, obviously, James is calling us to talk to God, right? Ask
Yes.
God. So
Love
that's
that.
prayer. So
Yep.
that one is right there. Just
Yep.
even if you don't know what it's going to look like, or you're sitting there going, "Well, I have no idea how to find joy in the midst of my suffering." That's right. We don't. That's the
Yeah.
whole point. We got
Yeah.
to ask God. God, I have no clue. This situation is so awful. I feel zero joy. How? Please help me see something here that where are you working in this situation? What are you doing that I can see a glimpse of hope in all of this? So
Yeah.
obviously, talk to God, prayer. The other is, and I put these in my book. This is chapter 12 of my book, right, Kayleigh?
Yeah. Mhm.
Where I put, my book has spiritual practices at the end of every chapter, and I connected it to some of these themes that we're talking about on the podcast. And for this one, I used two practices. Every so often, I combine two. And for this one, I combined meditation, which is the idea of like pausing and reflecting and thinking about something, but meditation not on our situation, but meditation on God, of things of
Yeah.
God. And we can meditate by simply sitting still somewhere and just letting our thoughts wander into whatever, just wander
Yes.
about. And then in that wandering, asking God, give me your wisdom, God, like speak to me in this wandering. But also you can just go on a walk and
Mhm.
enjoy nature and meditate as you look at the creation of God and see like how thoughtful God is about every detail of creation, all the different colors, all the different creatures, all the
Mhm.
different plants and trees and the air and the clouds and all the beautiful things we see when we're walking, and just remembering God's goodness even when things seem so painful. So
Yeah.
meditation is one. It takes our focus out of ourselves, because you don't want meditation to be a I'm just going to sit there and think about me the
Yeah.
whole time, which it can be, unless
Yeah.
you're again using James's own language. Consider, rethink, seek God's wisdom instead. So in
Yeah.
meditation, we're going to be thoughtful about it, but also it takes our eyes off of our problems and helps us seek them through the eyes of God.
Yeah.
That was one way. But then the other that I paired with that, because meditation is a solo event, and when we're suffering, we don't suffer alone. We should not
Yeah.
suffer alone. It's very difficult to find hope often alone, though God
Yeah.
can give it to us. He really is a triune God who is always in relationship, created us to be in relationship. And so we are also healed through relationship. And one of the ways we do that is by serving others, by taking our
Yes.
eyes out of our problems. And even if it's someone who's in the same circumstances we are, or in completely different circumstance, serving other people and caring for them. I found those two things to be really helpful in my own
Yeah.
journey of suffering, where or maybe in my own journey of trying to take my eyes out of myself.
Mhm.
Again, a high moment could be very self-centered. And so
Yeah.
in those moments too, I use service as a way to get myself out of my own bubble and
Yeah.
think about others, not just myself.
Well, and kind of like we talked about at the very beginning when I shared about my, chronic illnesses and how I can sit in that suffering space of, oh, this is all this stuff. And I can compare to the point that I am very self focused.
Yeah.
Or I can go out and support others who are dealing with chronic illnesses or issues of health in any way, shape, or form and support people in that process and serve them through it. I will say that although I've been dealing with this for many years, and I'm very open and transparent. If you ask me or if I'm in pain, I'll say it. Oh, yeah, today's a really bad day. I'm really struggling. XYZ is happening, or I've been going through a flare up for X number of months. One of the most beautiful things is that there are many people in my life who would never believe it. And that's not
Mm.
because of my own strength or even because I'm not in pain. It's because I have God's just joy in my heart so that despite the fact that I'm dealing with pain, I continue to live each day focused on
Yeah.
him. And so it's funny. I actually was at church a couple weeks ago. I had a really good friend of mine come up to me at the end of the day, and I was having a really bad pain day. And she was like, "Are you okay?" She's like, I
Mm.
don't see you normally like this." And I was like, "Oh yeah, my pain's bad. That's probably," she's like, "Yeah, like normally no matter what, you're always just like jumping around and bouncing around and talking to everyone." She's like, "And you just were more quiet today." And to me, that although it was a recognition, I was so grateful to know, okay, so normally, despite it, I'm still jumping and bouncing around, and people have gotten used to me always kind of being at that level. And that is not on me. That is not my strength. That is not my
Mm.
capacity. That's God's, who has kind of constantly just held me up and lifted me up. And as Paul says, right, like he sustains me for every good work and act of charity. And I truly believe that that's part of what's so beautiful. It's like, even in the midst of suffering, if we are serving out, then God will sustain us for every good work and act of charity. And so he can
So
do
true.
that for anyone listening today, no matter what's going on. And that doesn't mean that your suffering is not like, it's not real, or it's not, something to deal with, but just also please recognize that God is with you in it. You are not alone, and you can still exude a joy that is deeper than anything you could ever imagine because of who God is and what he can provide for you.
Yeah, he's faithful. We can trust him. So good, Kayleigh. I love it. This has been a great conversation, and obviously not to minimize anyone's suffering,
Yes.
because pain is pain and suffering
Yes.
is not good. But really to pray for our listeners that they, if they are, or if they know someone who are, that we are joining them in prayer for God's wisdom, for God's revelation of what he's doing in their lives, even in this season. And we know that God is doing something. He's working
Yes.
even in that season and working something out for the good, even though we not understand what it is. But he is, because he's faithful and he's trustworthy. So love it. Thank
Amen.
you so much for our conversation today.
Yes, thank you. This was awesome. If you all want to get a part of this conversation, we would love to hear from you. So you can actually
Yes.
leave comments now on Spotify. Please leave us a comment with this podcast. If you are watching on YouTube, you could leave us comments there as well so we can take part in the conversation. Or you can send us an email at hello@InezFranklin.com. Or you can send us a DM at Inez Franklin on Instagram. We are all over the place, and we would love
Yeah.
to participate in the
Yes.
conversation with you. Thank you so much for listening today, and may the grace and peace of Jesus Christ be with you today and all week long.
Amen.
Thank you for listening to Uncharted Podcast with Inez Franklin. Learn more about Inez at unchartedpod.com. Follow Inez's journey on Instagram at Inez Franklin. Sign up for our email list to receive direct access to online experiences and more. Thanks for listening, and join us again next time.